Today, protesters storm Kenya's parliament. The ICC issues an arrest warrant for Russia's ex-defense minister, and Iran prepares to hold its presidential election. From TLDR News, this is your daily briefing for Wednesday, the 26th of June, 2024. Violence erupted yesterday in Kenya's capital of Nairobi, as youth-led protests turned violent after lawmakers passed a controversial finance bill as part of a new IMF loan. The Kenyan parliament was quickly stormed and set alight, leaving hundreds of MPs stranded in the building, which led to security forces opening fire on protesters and a subsequent internet blackout. At least 5 people have died and 200 are currently injured. Aligned with the IMF's recommendations, the bill aims to raise $2.7 billion in additional taxes to reduce Kenya's high budget deficit and state borrowing. To help cut public debt, the government has proposed new tax measures in the bill, which include new levies on basic commodities like bread, vegetable oil, and sugar. An eco-levy on almost all manufactured goods, including sanitary towels and diapers, is also on the cards. In addition to the new taxes, the bill proposes increasing existing taxes on financial transactions. Protesters want the government to abandon the planned tax hikes, which they argue will choke the economy and raise the cost of living for Kenyans who are already struggling to make ends meet. Now, we should mention that Kenya's President, William Ruto, has dropped some of the more contentious proposals, particularly on basic commodities. However, some controversial measures remain untouched. These include a 16% tax on goods and services used by specialized hospitals, an increase in the general import tax from 2.5% to 3%. Protesters fear changes could result in higher healthcare costs and higher prices for imported products. Now, this is not the first time a finance bill has met with some resistance from citizens. Whilst Ruto was elected on a pledge to reduce poverty back in 2022, he has spent his first 2 years in office introducing a series of unpopular taxes. Nicknamed by citizens as Zacchaeus, Swahili for the biblical chief tax collector Zacchaeus, Ruto last year used the finance bill to introduce a housing tax and to raise the top personal income tax rate, sparking anger, street protests, and court challenges. Whilst these measures have caused chaos on the streets and widespread dissent amongst ordinary Kenyans, the measures have appeased international investors and the IMF, which has urged Kenya to address its heavy debt, which currently stands at 68% of GDP, higher than the 55% of GDP recommended by the World Bank and the IMF. In a public statement, the IMF said the bill is an important step in correcting Kenya's course. And in February, Kenya finally tapped international debt markets after years of being priced out of them. Now, whilst IMF structural reforms have in the past caused multiple protests across countries in the global south in the late 80s to the early 90s, Kenya isn't the only recent country to witness such demonstrations. Last year, Pakistan also saw protests triggered by IMF-recommended austerity measures. Now, there's more on the way, but remember to subscribe and ring the bell for more daily briefing tomorrow. Plus, if you want to support the channel like Camilo Pinto, then consider joining the new TLDR membership program for just $1.99. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Russia's Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, increasing the number of Russian officials charged by the ICC for actions in Ukraine to 6. Specifically, the ICC accuses Shoigu and Gerasimov of being responsible for the war crime of directing attacks at civilian objects, the war crime of causing excessive incidental harm to civilians or damage to civilian objects, and the crime against humanity of inhumane acts. At the heart of the charges are Russia's attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, about which the court said there were reasonable grounds to believe that the 2 suspects bear responsibility for missile strikes carried out by the Russian armed forces against the Ukrainian electric infrastructure from at least the 10th of October in 2022 until at least the 9th of March in 2023. The International Criminal Court doesn't have its own enforcement powers. In other words, it can't just go and arrest people it issues warrants for. However, it is the obligation of the court's member states to arrest those individuals if they set foot on their territory. Whilst major countries like Russia, China, India, the US, and Turkey are not party to the court, enough countries are that it can complicate the travel plans of these subjects to arrest warrants, as Vladimir Putin found when he couldn't travel to South Africa for a BRICS summit. Moving on now, Iran is preparing to hold its presidential election on Friday to elect a new leader who will replace the late President Ebrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash in May. The country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has called for maximum turnout in the election after parliamentary elections earlier this year saw the lowest turnout since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. 6 candidates, 5 conservatives and 1 reformist, have been approved to run in the election by the powerful Guardian Council, while more than 70 would-be candidates were rejected. All Iranians, men and women over the age of 18, are able to vote, and if no candidate wins more than 50% of the vote, then a runoff will be held between the two top candidates. Among the conservative candidates loyal to the regime are three-time candidate and current parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bahir Khalibaf and former senior nuclear negotiator Saeed Jalili. The sole reformist candidate in the race is heart surgeon Masoud Pezeshkian, who says he wants to negotiate with the West to try and revive parts of the nuclear deal, and has cautiously criticized the country's headscarf law. However, analysts suggest that success for Pezeshkian would require high turnout from a disillusioned electorate, and his campaign could be hampered if the Conservatives consolidate around a single candidate. In other news, American Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich has appeared at a Russian court to begin a closed-door trial for espionage, despite no evidence from Russian officials. It comes amid U.S. efforts to negotiate the release of Gershkovich and U.S. Marine veteran Paul Whelan, who was jailed for 16 years on similar charges in 2020 in a prisoner exchange. For context, Gershkovich was arrested in Yekaterinburg, a city in Russia's defense industrial heartland in the Ural Mountains, in March 2023, making him the first American to be arrested in Russia on espionage charges since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Prosecutors argue he was there collecting classified information about a Russian tank manufacturer on behalf of the CIA, charges the Wall Street Journal's editor-in-chief Emma Tucker called bogus. The US has accused Russia of conducting hostage diplomacy and says both Gershkovich and Whelan were wrongfully detained. Press freedom in Russia has also been further curtailed this week, with Moscow blocking scores of European media outlets in response to an EU ban on Russian state-funded media. The Kremlin has blocked access to 81 European news organizations inside Russia, including France's Le Monde and AFP, Germany's Der Spiegel and FAZ, and Italian and Spanish public broadcasters RAI and RTVE. And finally, in some uplifting news, a medical trial has shown promise for the use of inhaled insulin in people with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetics need to take insulin and will either inject it multiple times a day or use an insulin pump. However, if it's found to be effective, using an insulin inhaler, which could work like an asthma inhaler, could make life easier for people with diabetes and reduce the use of needles, as it would work alongside once daily long-acting injections. While the trial findings show mixed results across different patients, the lead investigator said that findings suggested that inhaled insulin may be good for patients who are especially engaged in their diabetes self-management. Now, before we finish today's briefing, I wanted to quickly tell you about the project we're working on called Too Long. Too Long is our new physical magazine that we will be releasing 3 times a year, running you through all of the key news events in more detail, and sometimes more intelligently than is possible on YouTube, with us able to choose the topics we think truly matter most and taking the time necessary to explain them, rather than being constrained by algorithms or click-through rates like we are on YouTube. Now, it's worth clarifying this really is a serious, high-quality magazine we're printing, full of interesting journalism with graphics to bring the stories to life. The first edition we're working on is our UK election special, so it'll run through the results of the election and discuss how the victors plan to rebuild Britain in a number of key policy areas. And the other half of the paper is dedicated to news around the world, including the European elections, France's snap election, Hungary's upcoming EU presidency, the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza, the tensions between US and China, and Japan's polycrisis, and of course, the US election. So if you are interested and want to support the channel, we'd really appreciate you considering picking up a copy. Click the link in the description to learn more. Plus, if you use TLDR daily, you'll get £2 off any order. Thank you for your support, and thanks for watching the Daily Briefing.